Sometimes the hardest hearts carry the deepest wounds, and the wildest souls need the gentlest touch. In Larkspur Crossing, widow Willa Mae Dunne challenges a drifter named Colt Morgan to tame her unbroken stallion, Hellfire. What starts as a dare becomes something neither expected. Willa built walls around her heart after losing her husband. Colt carries scars from a war that never truly ended. But when he works with her wild horse using patience instead of force, she sees a different kind of strength. Day by day, trust grows between them, all woman, man, and beast. When land thieves target her ranch, thinking a widow makes easy prey, they discover what happens when wounded hearts heal together. This is about second chances and finding love where you least expect it. But will a simple challenge to tame a horse be enough to tame two broken hearts? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Dunn Ranch as Willa Mae stepped onto her front porch, coffee mug in hand, surveying the land that had become both her sanctuary and her burden. 3 years had passed since Thomas died of the fever. 3 years since she'd last heard his laughter echoing through these hills. The ranch stretched before her like a promise kept, 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, a sturdy 2-story house he'd built with his own hands, and cattle that bore the Double D brand he'd designed during their courting days. The leather halter hanging from the porch rail caught her eye, its straps torn and frayed where Hellfire had broken free yet again. That black devil of a stallion had been Thomas's pride, a wild Mustang he'd captured but never broken. "Some things are meant to stay wild, Willa," he'd said, watching the horse rear and strike at anyone who dared approach. "Sometimes wild is exactly what they need to be." She'd understood then. Now, 3 years later, she wondered if he'd been talking about more than just the horse. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the dusty road that wound through the valley toward town. Larkspur Crossing sat nestled between rolling hills and a meandering creek, a community of maybe 300 souls who'd learned to respect Willa Mae Dunne as much as they'd loved her husband. She ran the finest cattle operation west of the river now, employing 6 hands year-round and double that during roundup. The bank respected her ledger, the townspeople tipped their hats, and not one man had dared court her. That suited her just fine. The rider coming up the road sat easy in his saddle, dust coating him like a second skin. Even from a distance, she could see he was travel-worn, the kind of man who'd been moving so long he'd forgotten how to stay still. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, showed the same signs of countless miles. As he drew closer, she made out a face weathered by sun and hardship, grey eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. He stopped at her gate without dismounting, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that belonged to an earlier time. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard the first time. "Name's Colt Morgan. I'm looking for work." Willa studied him over the rim of her coffee mug. She'd learned to read men quickly since Thomas died, the ones who thought a widow might be desperate, the ones who saw opportunity in her solitude, the ones who simply couldn't believe a woman could run a ranch without constant masculine guidance. This one felt different. He wasn't looking at her house with calculating eyes, or at her with anything other than polite patience. "Ranch work?" she asked. "Whatever needs doing. I'm handy with cattle, horses, repairs, not afraid of hard work." Something in his tone made her curious. Most drifters spoke with either desperate eagerness or practiced charm. This man simply stated facts, as if work was work, and he'd do it well regardless of her decision. "You have references?" A shadow crossed his features. "No, ma'am. Been traveling alone for some time now." The honesty surprised her. A smart man would have lied, created names and places she couldn't verify. His refusal to do so spoke of either integrity or exhaustion with deception. "I pay fair wages," she said. "Expect fair work. No drinking, no gambling, no trouble in town." "Understood. Bunkhouses behind the barn. Meals with the other hands. Sundays your own time." He nodded, finally dismounting. Up close, she could see the careful way he moved, as if something inside him had been broken and healed wrong. Scars showed white against tanned skin where his sleeve pulled back, and his eyes held the particular emptiness she'd seen in men who'd returned from the war between the states. "Obliged, ma'am," he said, leading his horse toward the barn. She watched him go, noting how he spoke quietly to his mount, how his hands stayed gentle on the reins, even when the gelding shied at a blowing paper. Something about the way he carried himself reminded her of Thomas, not in appearance, for her husband had been golden where this man was dark, but in that quality of quiet strength that needed no boasting. The morning routine called her back to the present. She had accounts to review, a meeting with the bank about expanding the herd, and a dozen other responsibilities that waited for no woman's wandering thoughts. But as she headed inside, she found herself glancing back toward the barn, where Colt Morgan was settling his horse, wondering what kind of man sought work without references and accepted it without negotiation. By evening, she had her answer, at least partially. Her foreman, Jake Rawlings, reported that the new hand worked without complaint, took direction well, and handled himself around the cattle like he'd been born to it. More importantly, the other men seemed to accept him as sign that, whatever his story might be, he wasn't trouble looking for a place to happen. She found him after supper, standing by the corral where Hellfire paced and snorted, black coat gleaming in the lamplight. The stallion had been in that pen for 2 days now, brought in from the far pasture for his monthly attempt at civilization. Every month she tried, hoping this time might be different. Every month, Hellfire reminded her why some things couldn't be forced. "Magnificent animal," Colt said without turning around. "Magnificent pain in the backside," Willa replied, joining him at the fence. "My husband captured him 4 years ago, never did break him to ride. Maybe breaking wasn't what he needed." The words were spoken so quietly she almost missed them. When she looked at Colt's face, she saw something there, recognition perhaps, or a kinship she didn't quite understand. "Every cowboy in 3 counties has tried," she said. "Best bronc riders, horse trainers, even brought in a man from California who claimed he could gentle any horse alive. Hellfire put them all in the dirt. Sometimes the ones that fight hardest have the most reason to." Again, that quiet observation that seemed to carry more weight than simple words. Willa found herself studying this strange man, who spoke like he understood something about fighting, about having reasons to resist gentle hands. "You think you could do better?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, carrying 3 years of frustration and a lifetime of being told what she couldn't handle alone. Colt turned to look at her then, and she saw something flicker in those grey eyes, not challenge or arrogance, but a kind of weary recognition. "I don't know, Mum, but I'd like to try." Before she could respond, the sound of voices and laughter drifted from the direction of town. Saturday night in Larkspur Crossing meant the saloons would be full of cowboys, celebrating the end of another week, their voices carrying on the night air as they boasted and bragged and told tales that grew larger with each telling. "Saloon gets busy on Saturday nights," she observed. "I expect so. You don't drink?" "Not anymore." The simple honesty of it struck her again. No excuses, no explanations, just a man who'd made a decision and intended to keep it. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Hellfire pace his pen like a caged storm. The stallion's eyes held intelligence and fury in equal measure, and when he looked at the humans watching him, Willa saw something that made her chest tighten. The horse wasn't just wild, he was lonely. Lonely and angry and tired of being approached by people who wanted to master him rather than understand him. "Thomas used to say some things were meant to stay wild," she said. "Maybe," Colt replied. "Or maybe they just need someone patient enough to let them choose trust instead of having it forced on them." The words hung in the air between them, carrying meanings she wasn't ready to examine. When she looked at him, she found him watching her with those steady grey eyes, and for a moment she felt exposed, as if he could see through the walls she'd built, as surely as he seemed to understand the horse. "I should get back to the house," she said, stepping away from the fence. "Good night, Mrs. Dunn." "Good night, Mr. Morgan." She walked away feeling his eyes on her back, and when she reached her porch, she turned to find him still standing by the corral, still watching Hellfire pace. Something about the sight made her think of two creatures, recognizing something kindred in each other, both scarred, both careful, both carrying wounds that might heal given enough time and patience. Inside her kitchen, she poured herself a cup of coffee she didn't want and sat at the table Thomas had built, surrounded by the life they'd created together. But for the first time in 3 years, her thoughts weren't entirely focused on what she'd lost. Instead, she found herself wondering about the quiet man by the corral, about the scars on his hands and the careful way he moved, about what had brought him to her gate, asking for work without references. Outside, Hellfire's hoofbeats echoed against the hard-packed earth as he continued his restless pacing, and she wondered if Colt Morgan was still there, still watching, still seeing something in the wild stallion that others had missed. Maybe Thomas had been right about some things needing to stay wild. But maybe, just maybe, wild didn't have to mean alone. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything seem possible. Willa stepped onto her porch to find Colt Morgan already at work, mucking out stalls with the steady rhythm of a man who understood that good work began before the sun climbed high. She'd expected him to sleep late after his first day, maybe need coaxing into the routine like most new hands. Instead, he'd been up before dawn, his horse fed and groomed, his few belongings neatly arranged in the bunkhouse corner Jake had shown him. She was finishing her second cup of coffee when he approached the house, hat in hand, moving with that same careful precision she'd noticed the day before. "Mrs. Dunne," he said, stopping at the bottom of her porch steps, "I was wondering if I might have a word." "Speak your mind." "About the stallion. I'd like to try working with him if you're agreeable." Willa set down her cup, studying his face for signs of the cockiness that had marked every other man who'd made the same request. She found not only that quiet determination that seemed to be his natural state. "Every cowboy in 3 counties has tried," she said. "What makes you think you'd fare any better?" "I don't know that I would, but I've been thinking about what you said about your husband believing some things should stay wild. Maybe the problem isn't the horse. Maybe it's how he's been approached." Something in his tone made her step down from the porch, closing the distance between them. Up close, she could see the sincerity in his grey eyes, but also something else, recognition that went deeper than simple horse sense. "That stallion has put men in the hospital," she said. "Broken ribs, broken arms. One fellow from over in Millerville nearly lost his life when Hellfire threw him into the fence post. I understand the risk." "Do you? Because I won't have a man's death on my conscience, not over a horse that can't be ridden." Colt was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting toward the corral where Hellfire stood with his head high, nostrils flaring as he tested the morning air. "During the war," he said finally, "I saw men try to break horses with force, thinking speed and strength would get them mounted and moving. Those horses either broke completely or never stopped fighting. But the men who took time, who let the horse come to trust first their mounts, would follow them anywhere, even into cannon fire." The mention of the war explained much about the careful way he moved, the scars on his hands, the particular emptiness she'd glimpsed in his eyes. Willa had seen enough returning soldiers to recognize the signsman who'd learned hard lessons about patience and violence, about what could be won through force and what could only be earned through time. "This isn't a battlefield," she said gently. "No, ma'am, but trust works the same way everywhere." She looked toward the corral again, watching Hellfire pace his endless circuit. For 3 years, she'd authorized attempt after attempt to break the stallion, each failure adding to her frustration and the horse's fury. Maybe it was time to try something different. "What would you do differently?" "Start slow. Let him get used to my presence before I ask for anything. No ropes, no forcing. Just time and patience until he decides I'm not a threat." "That could take weeks." "Yes, ma'am. Most men want results by sundown. Most men are in a hurry to prove something. I'm not." The simple honesty of it decided her. Against every practical instinct she'd developed as a ranch owner, Against the voice in her head that sounded like Thomas warning her about taking chances, she found herself nodding. "All right, Mr. Morgan, you can try, but the first sign he's going to hurt you, we stop. Understood?" "Understood." They walked to the corral together, and Willa felt a flutter of nervousness she hadn't expected. Something about this felt different from the other attempts, more significant somehow, as if the outcome would matter beyond simple horsebreaking. Hellfire stood at the far end of the pen, black coat gleaming in the morning sun, every line of his body speaking of barely contained power. When he saw them approaching, his ears flattened, and he began that familiar pacing, hooves striking the ground with sharp precision. Colt stopped at the gate, but didn't open it. Instead, he simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, making no sudden movements. The stallion eyed him warily, continuing his restless circuit but gradually slowing as curiosity warred with caution. "He's beautiful," Colt said quietly. "He's dangerous." "Yes, but look at his eyes, there's intelligence there, and pride. He's not mean-spirited, just tired of being misunderstood." Willa looked where he indicated and felt a shock of recognition. She'd seen that same expression in her bedroom mirror for 3 years, the wary intelligence of something that had learned to expect disappointment, the pride that refused to submit even when submission might be easier. "How long do you plan to just stand there?" she asked. "As long as it takes for him to decide I'm not going anywhere." It was then that she noticed something else about Colt Morgan, way he breathed, slow and steady, the relaxed set of his shoulders, the patience that seemed to emanate from him like warmth from a banked fire. This wasn't the forced calm of a man trying to prove his courage. This was the deep quiet of someone who had learned to wait. Minutes passed. Hellfire's pacing slowed further, his attention increasingly focused on the still figure by the gate. Colt didn't move, didn't speak, didn't do anything but exist in that space, with a kind of peaceful presence that seemed to puzzle the stallion. "He's never had anyone just stand there before," Willa observed. "Everyone's always wanted something from him right away. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is want nothing at all." The words carried a weight that made her look at him sharply. There was story there, pain carefully contained, and wisdom bought with experience she could only guess at. This man understood something about being approached by people who wanted to take rather than give, who saw strength as something to be conquered rather than respected. After 20 minutes, Hellfire stopped pacing entirely. He stood near the center of the pen, head high, watching Colt with an expression that seemed almost thoughtful. The hostility was still there, but tempered now with curiosity. "That's enough for today," Colt said, stepping back from the gate. "That's it? You're not going in?" "No, ma'am. Today was about letting him see me. Tomorrow we'll see if he remembers." As they walked back toward the barn, Willa found herself stealing glances at this strange man who measured progress in minutes of mutual regard rather than dramatic conquests. Everything about his approach went against conventional wisdom, yet something in her responded to it, perhaps because she understood, better than she cared to admit, what it felt like to be approached by people who wanted to fix or claim or change rather than simply accept. "Mr. Morgan," she said as they reached the barn, "what did you do in the war?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the particular flatness of a man discussing events he'd rather forget. "Cavalry scout. Spent most of my time alone, moving between camps, carrying messages. Got good at reading the country, reading horses, reading when to move and when to stay still." "Is that where you learned about patience?" "That's where I learned what happens when you don't have it." He reached into his saddlebag then, and for just a moment, she caught a glimpse of something metallic, a medal or decoration wrapped in cloth and buried beneath his few possessions. The sight of it, hidden away like a shameful secret, told her more about Colt Morgan than hours of conversation might have. This was a man carrying honors he no longer believed he deserved, recognition for service that had cost him more than it had given. The careful way he moved, the deliberate gentleness with his horse, the patience he showed with Hellfire, all of it spoke to someone trying to prove to himself that he could still do good in the world, that his hands could heal instead of harm. "I should get back to work," he said, closing the saddlebag. "Of course. But Mr. Morgan, thank you for trying a different way." He nodded and walked away, leaving her standing in the barn doorway with questions she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. But as she watched him return to his morning tasks, she found herself thinking about medals hidden in saddlebags and the kind of man who would bury his honors rather than display them. That evening, as the sun painted the hills gold and red, she found him back at the corral. Hellfire stood in the same spot where he'd stopped that morning, and though the stallion's ears flicked back when Colt approached, there was less hostility in the gesture, more wariness than anger. "He remembers you," she said, joining Colt at the fence. "He's deciding whether that's good or bad." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stallion watch them back. For the first time in 3 years, Willa felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chestnut, just for the horse. But for the quiet man beside her, who seemed to understand that some victories couldn't be rushed, some trust couldn't be forced, and some healing happened only when you stopped trying to make it happen and simply created space for it to grow. 3 days into Colt's patient vigil with Hellfire, Willa found herself rearranging her morning routine to include time at the corral. She told herself it was simple curiosity about his methods, but the truth settled deeper than that. Something about watching him work her, rather, not work-stirred memories she'd kept carefully buried since Thomas died. The carved wooden horse sat on her dresser where it had always been, gathering dust in the morning light that slanted through her bedroom windows. Thomas had whittled it during their first winter together, when snow kept them housebound and dreams seemed as real as the fire in their hearth. They'd talked then about the children who would ride real ponies around the ranch, about the family that would fill the house with laughter and purpose. The fever that took Thomas had also taken those dreams, leaving her with a ranch to run and a future that stretched ahead like an empty pasture. She'd packed away the cradle he'd built, donated the tiny clothes she'd sewn in hopeful anticipation, but the wooden horse remained too precious to discard, too painful to truly see. Now, watching Colt's methodical approach to Hellfire, she found herself thinking about patience of a different kind. The patience required to build something lasting, to wait for love to grow roots deep enough to weather whatever storms might come. "He's getting closer," she observed, noting how the stallion now stood only 10 feet from where Colt waited by the gate. "Curiosity's winning over caution," Colt agreed. "Another day or two, he might let me into the pen." His quiet confidence impressed her. Most men would have grown frustrated by now, eager to prove their mastery. Colt seemed content to measure progress in inches, to celebrate the small victory of Hellfire's decreased pacing, his ears spending more time forward than back. "My husband was like you," she said without thinking, then immediately wished she could take the words back. Talking about Thomas with another man felt like a betrayal, even 3 years later. "How so?" The gentle question, asked without prying or assumption, somehow made it easier to answer. "Patient. He never rushed anything, not the horses, not the ranch, not me." She smiled at the memory. "I was 18 when we married, thought I knew everything about everything. He could have corrected me, could have insisted on doing things his way. Instead, he let me learn by trying, let me come to understanding in my own time." Sounds like a wise man. He was. The admission came easier than she'd expected. "I miss the thieving someone who believed I could figure things out instead of someone trying to solve everything for me." Colt glanced at her then, and she saw understanding in his grey eyes. Not pity, not the careful sympathy she'd grown tired of receiving, but recognition from someone who knew what it meant to lose something irreplaceable. "The ranch hands respect you," he said. "That doesn't happen by accident. I had to earn it. Some of them thought I'd fold within a year, sell out to one of the big outfits in Denver. Others figured I'd remarry quick, let a husband take over the real decisions. But you didn't." "No, I didn't." She looked out at the land that had become both her burden and her pride. "There were nights I thought about it, especially that first winter. But this place, it's what Thomas and I built together. Selling would have felt like giving up on everything we dreamed." They stood in comfortable silence, watching Hellfire graze near the water trough. The stallion's proximity to Colt no longer seemed to disturb him, though he still kept a wary eye on the gate. "What about you?" Willa asked. "Ever think about settling somewhere permanent?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. His hands stilled on the fence rail, and she saw that careful blankness settle over his features, the look of a man who'd trained himself not to want things he couldn't have. "Not for a long time," he said finally. "The war changed that for you?" "The war changed everything." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Hard to make plans for the future when you're not sure you deserve one." The words were spoken so softly she almost missed them, but their impact hit her like a physical blow. She turned to study his profile, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his scarred hands gripped the fence rail. "What makes you think you don't deserve a future?" He didn't answer immediately, and she wondered if she'd pushed too far. But then he looked at her, and she saw something raw and unguarded in his eyes. "I did things during the war, Mrs. Dunn. Necessary things, maybe, but things that changed me, made me into someone I'm not sure I recognize. The war was over 10 years ago. Some wars don't end just because the fighting stops." She understood that better than he might have expected. Her own war had been different, fought against loneliness, against doubt, against the voices that told her she couldn't manage alone. But she recognized the weariness in his voice, the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting too long. "Thomas used to say that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is forgive themselves," she said gently. "Your husband sounds like he was full of wisdom." He was, but he was also wrong about some things. She looked at the wooden horse in her memory, at the dreams it represented. He thought we had all the time in the world. Thought there would always be tomorrow to start the family we wanted, to take the trips we planned, to say the things that mattered. Regret's a hard burden to carry. Yes, but so is thinking you don't deserve happiness. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake Rawlings, her foreman, leading a group of ranch hands back from checking the far pastures. Jake had been with the ranch since before she married Thomas, a steady man in his 50s who'd become something like an older brother to her in the years since she'd been widowed. "Afternoon, Mrs. Dunn, Colt," Jake said, touching his hat brim. "How's our patient today?" "Making progress," Colt replied, slow but steady. Jake studied Hellfire with the practiced eye of a man who'd worked with horses all his life. "I'll be honest, I didn't expect much when you said you wanted to try. But he looks calmer, less wound up. Patience suits him better than force did," Willa observed. "Patience suits most things better than force," Jake agreed, then gave her a meaningful look. "Speaking of which, that Wheeler fellow from the bank stopped by this morning while you were out, said he needs to discuss some business with you." Willa felt her stomach tighten. Marcus Wheeler had been pressuring her for months to consider selling parts of her land to developers from back east who wanted to build a railroad spur through the valley. The money would be substantial, but it would also mean losing some of the best grazing land on the ranch. "What kind of business?" "Didn't say. Just that it was important and he'd be back tomorrow." She nodded, though the news settled uneasily in her chest. Wheeler had been Thomas's friend, but his loyalty seemed to be shifting toward whatever brought the bank the most profit. The railroad men had deep pockets, and she suspected Wheeler was getting pressure from his superiors to close the deal. "We'll deal with it when he comes," she said, but her voice carried less confidence than she'd intended. After Jake and the other hands moved on, Colt remained by the fence, his attention seemingly focused on Hellfire, but his awareness clearly attuned to her mood. "Trouble?" he asked quietly. "Maybe. The railroad wants to buy a strip of land through the middle of my best pasture. The bank thinks I should sell. But you don't want to. Thomas and I chose this land carefully. Every acre serves a purpose. Selling that strip would be like—" She paused, searching for the right comparison. "Like cutting the heart out of something living. Then don't sell." The simple statement, delivered with quiet conviction, surprised her. Most people approached her business decisions with elaborate advice, lengthy explanations of market forces, and practical considerations. Colt's straightforward support felt like a gift. "It might not be that simple. The bank holds my mortgage. Banks need customers more than customers need banks. You're not some greenhorn who borrowed more than you could pay back. This ranch turns a profit." His confidence in her business sense warmed something in her chest that had been cold for too long. When had she stopped trusting her own judgment, started second-guessing every decision through the lens of what others might think? "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For assuming I know what I'm doing." He looked at her then with something that might have been surprise. "Why would I assume anything else? You've built something here worth protecting. That doesn't happen by accident." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Willa found herself reluctant to leave the peaceful scene by the corral. There was something soothing about watching Colt's patient presence gradually winning Hellfire's cautious acceptance, something that spoke to possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to consider in years. Maybe Thomas had been right about some things being meant to stay wild. But maybe he'd also been right about the power of patience, about giving trust time to grow instead of demanding it be granted all at once. And maybe, just maybe, the dreams represented by that wooden horse on her dresser didn't have to remain forever buried in the past. By the end of the first week, Hellfire allowed Colt into the pen. Not eagerly, the stallion still maintained a careful distance, ears swiveling to track every movement, but without the explosive panic that had marked every previous attempt. Willa watched from the fence as Colt simply stood in the center of the corral, making no move toward the horse, asking nothing more than tolerance of his presence. "You're in," she said when he emerged after 30 minutes of shared silence. "First step," he agreed. "Now we see if he'll let me stay." That evening, Willa found herself lingering after supper, clearing dishes that didn't need clearing, checking accounts she'd already balanced twice. The truth was, she'd grown accustomed to Colt's quiet presence at her table. Unlike the ranch hands who ate quickly and returned to the bunkhouse for cards and conversation, Colt seemed in no hurry to leave. He helped with the washing up without being asked, dried plates with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. "Tell me about your family," she said as they worked side by side in the kitchen. The question surprised her. She hadn't planned to ask it, but the domestic peace of the moment seemed to invite confidences. "Not much family left to speak of," he said, hanging the dish towel on its hook with precise movements. "Parents died when I was 15. Older brother raised me until the war started." "What happened to your brother?" "Gettysburg, July 2nd, 1863. The date came out flat and emotionless, the way men spoke of losses too large for feeling. He was cavalry, like me. Took a shell fragment while trying to reach the wounded." Willa's hands stilled in the soapy water. She'd heard enough war stories to recognize the particular pain of losing someone to heroism, the complicated grief of mourning a death that meant something larger than personal loss, but hurt just as much. "I'm sorry. He was a good man, better than me in most ways." Colt moved to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. "Used to write letters to a girl back home. Planned to marry her when the war ended. Had it all figured out, the farm they'd buy, the children they'd have, the kind of life they'd build together. What happened to the girl?" "She waited. 2 years after the war ended, she was still waiting. I went to see her, to give her Daniel's letters, tell her how he died." His voice grew quieter. She was still wearing his ring, still hoping maybe there'd been some mistake. I couldn't let her waste her life waiting for a ghost." "So you told her the truth?" "I told her Daniel was dead and she needed to live her life. She married a shopkeeper 6 months later, had 3 children last I heard. She's happy." There was something in the way he said it that made Willa look at him more closely. "But you've been drifting ever since." Seemed like the right thing to do. Daniel was the one who knew how to settle down, how to build something lasting. I was just the scout, the one who moved ahead and reported back. After he died, I didn't know how to stop moving." Willa dried her hands on her apron, understanding flooding through her. "You don't think you deserve what he wanted?" "I know I don't." The certainty in his voice broke something open in her chest. She moved closer, noting how he tensed when she approached, ready to retreat if she asked for more than he could give. "What if you're wrong?" she asked gently. "What if I'm not?" They stood in the lamplight, Two people carrying different kinds of loss, different kinds of guilt about surviving when others hadn't. Willa thought about the letters upstairs in her dresser, Thomas's letters from their courtship, full of dreams and promises and the sweet certainty of young love. She'd read them again just that morning, trying to remember what it felt like to believe in forever. "Thomas wrote me letters when we were courting," she said. "Beautiful letters, full of plans and promises. I kept them all, read them sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly sorry for myself. That's not the same thing, isn't it? I read those letters and remember the woman I used to be, the one who believed in happily ever after, who thought love was enough to protect us from everything that could go wrong. Sometimes I think that woman died with Thomas, and I'm just someone pretending to be her." Colt turned from the window to look at her directly. "You're not pretending anything. You're exactly who you need to be." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've been watching you. The way you run this ranch, the way your men respect you, the way you face every challenge without backing down. That's not pretense, Mrs. Dunn. That's strength." His words settled into the hollow places in her chest, like warmth spreading through cold rooms. When had someone last spoken to her with such simple certainty about her worth? "Willa," she said impulsively. "Ma'am?" "My name is Willa. I think we've moved past formalities, don't you?" He considered this, and she saw something shift in his expressiona, careful lowering of barriers he'd kept in place since arriving at her ranch. "Willa," he said, and the sound of her name in his quiet voice made her stomach flutter in ways she'd forgotten were possible. They were interrupted by a knock at the kitchen door. Jake Rawlings stood on the porch, hat in hand, his expression troubled. "Sorry to bother you this late, Mrs. Willa," he said, clearly having heard the tail end of their conversation. "But we've got a problem. Found some surveyor's stakes up on the North Ridge this afternoon. Fresh ones." Willa felt her chest tighten. "Where exactly?" "Right along the route that railroad fellow mapped out last month. Someone's been measuring, marking boundaries. Without permission. Doesn't look like they asked permission for anything. Tom Fletcher found boot prints all over that ridge, saw wagon tracks leading back toward town." Colt stepped forward, his bearing subtly shifting to something more alert, more military. How many men would it take to set those stakes? 3, maybe 4, definitely more than one person could handle alone. "And they came from town?" "Tracks suggest it. Could be Wheeler sent them, or maybe the railroad men are getting impatient." Willa moved to the window, looking out toward the North Ridge, though she couldn't see it in the darkness. That land represented some of her best grazing, the heart of what made the ranch profitable. If someone was surveying it without her consent, it suggested pressure was building beyond simple bankers' requests. "We'll ride up there tomorrow," she decided, "see exactly what they've marked." "I'll come with you," Colt said. "That's not necessary." "Yes, it is." His voice carried a quiet authority that reminded her he'd been more than just a cavalry scout. "If someone's making moves on your land without permission, you need to know who and why, and you need witnesses." Jake nodded approvingly. "Colt's right. This feels like more than simple surveying. Someone's testing boundaries." After Jake left, Willa found herself pacing the kitchen, restless energy making it impossible to settle. The surveyor's stakes felt like a violation, a challenge to everything she'd built and fought to maintain. "Hey," Colt said gently, catching her arm as she passed him for the third time. "We'll figure this out." The simple touch, the quiet confidence in his voice, steadied her more than she'd expected. She looked down at his hand on her armsguard, but gentle, strong but careful, and felt something shift inside her chest. "I know we will," she said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. When she climbed the stairs to her bedroom that night, she found herself looking at the faded love letters in her dresser drawer with different eyes. Thomas's words about forever and always seemed both precious and distant now, part of a different life lived by a younger woman who hadn't yet learned how quickly everything could change. But maybe that was all right. Maybe love didn't have to be about forever promises and grand declarations. Maybe sometimes it was about quiet moments in lamplight, about hands that touched gently and voices that spoke with certainty about a person's worth. Maybe love could be about finding someone who understood that wild things needed patience, that broken things needed time, that some of the most valuable things in life came to those willing to wait for trust to grow naturally instead of demanding it be given all at once. Outside her window, she could see the glow of lamplight from the barn, where Colt was probably settling his horse for the night. Tomorrow, they would ride out to face whatever challenge the surveyor's stakes represented. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Willa fell asleep, thinking about the future instead of mourning the past. The surveyor's stakes stood like accusations across the North Ridge, bright yellow flags snapping in the morning breeze. Willa counted 12 of them, marking a straight line that would cut directly through her best grazing land, dividing the ranch in a way that would make half of it nearly useless. Professional work, Colt observed, dismounting to examine the nearest stake. These weren't set by amateurs. Jake spat into the dust, his weathered face dark with anger. No by your leave or mind if we measure your land. Just came in like they owned the place. Willa studied the line of stakes, her chest tight with a mixture of fury and fear. The railroad men had been polite during their previous visits, full of talk about progress and mutual benefit. This felt different, like a declaration that her wishes didn't matter, that the outcome had already been decided. Mrs. Dunne, Tom Fletcher, one of her younger hands, pointed toward the valley. Riders coming up from town. 3 men on horseback were making their way up the ridge, moving with the deliberate pace of people who expected to be welcomed. Even at a distance, Willa recognized Marcus Wheeler's portly figure and expensive hat. The 2 men with him were strangers, well-dressed city types who sat their horses like men unaccustomed to the saddle. "Right on schedule," she muttered. "You want us to stay?" Jake asked quietly. "Please." She looked at Colt, who had remounted and positioned himself slightly behind her right shoulder close. Enough to intervene if needed, far enough back to avoid seeming threatening. "All of you." Wheeler's smile was too broad when he reached them, the kind of forced friendliness that preceded bad news. "Willa, good to see you out enjoying this beautiful morning. Gentlemen, may I present Mrs. Thomas Dunne, owner of the finest ranch in the valley." The strangers nodded politely, but Willa caught them glancing at the stakes, making mental notes about the land. One pulled a small notebook from his vest pocket. "Mr. Wheeler," she said coolly, "I wasn't expecting visitors." "Well, you know how business is. Opportunities don't wait for convenient timing. These gentlemen are from the Colorado and Southern Railroad. Mr. Blackwood and Mr. Provence Hayes have come all the way from Denver to discuss the rail line we talked about." Blackwood, the taller of the 2 strangers, touched his hat brim. "Mrs. Dunne, we apologize for the informal visit, but time is rather pressing. The railroad is eager to begin construction before winter sets in." "Construction of what exactly?" "Why, the spur line through your property," Hayes said, as if it were already settled. "Mr. Wheeler assured us you were amenable to the arrangement." Willa felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mr. Wheeler spoke prematurely. "I haven't agreed to sell any of my land." "Now, Willa," Wheeler said with the patronizing tone she'd grown to hate, "we discussed this. The railroad is offering top dollar more than this land is worth for grazing. You could pay off your mortgage and have money left over to expand somewhere else." "I don't want to expand somewhere else. I want to keep my ranch intact." Blackwood consulted his notebook. "Mrs. Dunne, perhaps you don't understand the scope of what we're proposing. This rail line will connect Denver directly to the mining operations in the Western Mountains. The economic benefits to the region will be substantial." "The economic benefits to my ranch will be 0, she replied sharply. "That rail line would cut my grazing land in half. The northern pastures would be worthless without access to water." "Surely that's an exaggeration," Hayes said dismissively. "There are other water sources." "There are no other water sources," Colt said quietly, speaking for the first time since the men arrived. "Not reliable ones. Anyone who'd surveyed this land properly would know that." The railroad men turned to look at him with the kind of dismissive attention reserved for hired help who'd spoken out of turn. Wheeler's face reddened. I don't believe we've been introduced, Blackwood said coldly. Colt Morgan. I work for Mrs. Dunne. Well, Mr. Morgan, perhaps you should leave business discussions to people who understand them. Something shifted in Colt's posture, subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read the signs. Jake and Tom Fletcher moved slightly closer, recognizing the tension. I understand enough, Colt said, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge now. I understand that those stakes were set without permission on private property. I understand that you're trying to pressure a woman into selling land she doesn't want to sell. And I understand that if you were gentlemen, you'd have asked before you measured. How dare you, Hayes began, but Willa cut him off. Mr. Morgan is absolutely right. You had no authorization to survey my land. I want those stakes removed immediately. Wheeler mopped his forehead with a handkerchief, clearly uncomfortable with how the conversation was developing. Now, Willa, let's all calm down. These gentlemen have come a long way. To trespass on my land and assume I'd roll over like a trained dog, she finished. I'm afraid they've wasted their trip. Blackwood's face hardened. Mrs. Dunne, I think you're making a mistake. The railroad will build this line with or without your cooperation. We can acquire the necessary land through eminent domain if required. Try it, she said, her voice carrying the steel that had earned her the respect of every rancher in the valley. I'll fight you in every court from here to Washington. Fighting costs money, Hayes pointed out with a thin smile. Legal battles can be expensive, especially for someone operating on credit. The threat was barely veiled, but it landed like a physical blow. Willa felt her stomach drop as she realized what they were really saying, that they'd use her mortgage against her, pressure Wheeler to call in her loans if she didn't cooperate. Gentlemen, Colt said, and something in his tone made all three visitors look at him sharply. I think you've said enough. This doesn't concern you, Cowboy, Blackwood sneered. When you threaten Mrs. Dunne's livelihood, it concerns me. Colt's horse shifted restlessly beneath him, responding to some tension in his rider that wasn't visible to the casual observer. Now, she's asked you to remove your stakes and leave her property. I suggest you do so. Are you threatening us? Hayes demanded. I'm suggesting that trespassing is illegal in Colorado territory, and that Mrs. Dunne has witnesses to your admission that you surveyed her land without permission. Wheeler looked increasingly desperate. Let's all take a step back here. There's no need for threats or talk of legal action. Surely we can reach some accommodation. No, Willa said firmly. We can't. This is my land, gentlemen. My husband and I chose it carefully, worked it fairly, and built something we were proud of. I won't sell it to be carved up for your convenience. You may not have a choice, Blackwood said bluntly. The railroad has significant influence with territorial authorities. Your mortgage holder answers to banks that have relationships with our investors. Perhaps you should consider your position more carefully. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Willa felt the support of her men around her, Jake's solid presence, Tom Fletcher's young indignation, and behind it all, Colt's quiet strength that seemed to radiate certainty that she could handle whatever came next. My position is clear, she said. Remove your stakes, and don't set foot on my land again without written permission. You're making a serious error in judgment, Hayes warned. The only error would be trusting men who survey land without asking and make threats when they don't get their way immediately. Blackwood and Hayes exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Then Blackwood smiled a cold expression that didn't touch his eyes. Very well, Mrs. Dunne. We'll remove our stakes. But this conversation isn't over. Yes, it is, she replied. The railroad men turned their horses and rode down the ridge without another word, leaving Wheeler to mop his sweating face and attempt damage control. Willa, you have to understand, these men have resources, connections. They're not accustomed to being told no. Then it's time they learned, she said curtly. And Marcus, if I find any more surveyors' stakes on my property, I'll assume you authorize them. Now that's not fair. Fair would have been asking my permission before letting strangers measure my land. Fair would have been supporting your friend's widow instead of throwing in with railroad speculators. Wheeler's face crumpled slightly, and for a moment she saw a glimpse of the man who'd stood beside Thomas at their wedding, who'd helped them negotiate their first cattle purchase. The bank has pressures too, Willa. These railroad investments, they could benefit everyone in the valley. Everyone except the people whose land you're stealing. After Willa rode away, shaking his head and muttering about stubborn women, Willa found herself alone on the ridge with her men. The surveyor's stakes stood like yellow accusations in the morning light, and she knew they represented more than simple measurements. "They'll be back," Jake said grimly. "Yes, they will." She looked at Colt, who was studying the stakes with the analytical eye of someone accustomed to reading terrain for strategic advantage. "What do you think?" "I think they're not as confident as they pretended to be," he said slowly. "If they had legal authority to take your land, they wouldn't be trying to pressure you into selling. They need your cooperation, which means you have more power than they want you to realize. But they weren't bluffing about having influence. No, they have money and connections, which means they can make things difficult, but difficult isn't the same as impossible." Tom Fletcher had been pulling up stakes while they talked, and now he approached with an armload of the yellow markers. "What should I do with these?" "Burn them," Willa said without hesitation. "And Tommy want you and the other boys to keep an eye on the boundaries. Anyone comes on this land without permission, I want to know about it immediately." "Yes, ma'am." As they rode back toward the ranch house, Willa found herself thinking about Hellfire pacing his corral, about the patience required to win trust from something that had learned to expect betrayal. The railroad men reminded her of all the cowboys who'd tried to break her stallion with forecertain that power and intimidation would get them what they wanted, unable to understand that some things couldn't be taken, only earned. "Thank you," she said to Colt as they crested the hill that overlooked the ranch buildings. "For what?" "For having my back up there, for understanding that this land matters more than money. It's your home," he said simply. "A person's home is worth defending." The certainty in his voice stirred something warm in her chest. When had someone last spoken about defending her, protecting what mattered to her? When had she felt like she had a true partner instead of just hired help? That evening, as she watched Colt work with Hellfire in the gathering dusk, she marveled at the progress they'd made. The stallion now allowed himself to be touched, cautious acceptance of gentle hands on his neck, his shoulder, still wild, still proud, but no longer alone in his defiance. Maybe that was what she'd been missing since Thomas died, not someone to take over her battles, but someone willing to stand beside her while she fought them herself. Someone who understood that strength didn't always mean charging ahead, that sometimes the greatest victories came through patience, persistence, and the willingness to let trust grow slowly instead of demanding it all at once. 2 weeks after the confrontation on the ridge, Hellfire wore a saddle for the first time in his life. Not easily, the stallion had snorted and danced and shown every sign of barely controlled panic, but he'd allowed the leather to settle across his back without exploding into the violent fury that had marked every previous attempt. Willa watched from the fence as Colt stood beside the horse, one hand resting gently on the black neck, his voice a low murmur of reassurance. The trust between them had grown into something beautiful to witness, wild spirit accepting gentle strength, patience rewarded with cautious partnership. "He's ready to try carrying weight," Colt said when he emerged from the pen. "Maybe tomorrow if he seems calm." "You really think he'll let you ride him?" "I think he'll let me try. Whether I stay in the saddle is another question." His quiet confidence had become as familiar to her as morning coffee, as comforting as the sound of cattle settling for the night. Somewhere in the past few weeks, Colt Morgan had stopped being her hired hand and become something else, something she wasn't quite ready to name, but couldn't deny feeling. That evening, they sat on her front porch, as had become their custom, watching the sun paint the hills gold and red. The domesticity of it struck her sometime show. Natural it felt to have him there. How easily conversation flowed between them, how right it seemed to share the peaceful end of each day. "Tell me about your first horse," she said, settling into the chair Thomas had built for summer evenings. "A mare named Duchess. Belonged to my father, but she took a shine to me when I was about 10. Used to follow me around like a dog, looking for sugar lumps." What happened to her? Sold her when the bank took our farm. I was 15. My parents had just died of typhoid, and Daniel and I couldn't make the payments. His voice carried the particular pain of old losses, wounds that had healed, but left scars. I cried when they led her away. Hadn't cried over my parents' deaths, but seeing Duchess walk away with strangers broke something in me. Willa understood that kind of delayed grief, the way some losses hit immediately, while others waited until you felt safe enough to feel them fully. Is that when you and Daniel enlisted? 2 years later. Seemed like the only option for boys with no family, no prospects. The army promised steady pay and 3 meals a day. At 17, that looked like prosperity. She studied his profile in the lamplight, noting the way shadows emphasized the strong line of his jaw, the careful set of his shoulders. Even relaxed, he carried himself like a man ready to move quickly if needed, a wariness that spoke to experiences she could only imagine. Do you ever think about settling down, having a place of your own? The question surprised her as soon as it left her lips. She hadn't meant to ask it, hadn't realized she was curious about his long-term plans until the words were already spoken. Colt was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkening hills. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a careful neutrality that told her the question mattered more than he wanted to admit. I think about it sometimes, but thinking and believing are different things. What do you mean? I mean that some men are meant to build homes and raise families, and others are meant to keep moving. I've been moving so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay still. You've been still here for almost a month. That's different. How? He turned to look at her then, and she saw something vulnerable in his grey eyes, longing he was trying to hide behind practical considerations. Because this isn't my place. I'm just passing through, helping out until you find someone permanent. The words stung more than she'd expected. Had she given him the impression that his presence was temporary, that she was simply using his skills until something better came along? What if I don't want someone permanent? She said carefully. What if I wanted you to stay? The silence stretched between them, full of implications neither seemed ready to voice. Colt's hands tightened on the porch rail, and she saw him wrestling with something, hope, warring with experience, desire fighting with the learned caution of a man who'd been disappointed before. Mrs. Dunn, I don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. No, you don't. He stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the porch like a caged animal. You see me working with your horse, helping around the ranch, and you think that makes me someone I'm not. But I'm not the settling kind, Willa. I'm not the man who builds cradles and plans for the future. The mention of cradles hit her like a physical blow, reminding her of dreams she'd buried with Thomas. But instead of the familiar stab of loss, she felt something else, a recognition that those old dreams might not be the only ones worth having. Maybe settling isn't about cradles and future plans, she said quietly. Maybe it's about finding someone who makes you want to stop running. He turned to stare at her, something raw and unguarded flickering across his features. For a moment, she thought he might say something that would change everything between them. Then his expression shuttered, and she saw him retreat behind the careful walls he'd built around his heart. I should check on the horses, he said. Colt. Good night, Willa. She watched him walk away, his shoulders rigid with the effort of maintaining distance from something he clearly wanted. The sight of it broke her heart a little, not just for herself, but for him. She recognized the signs of someone who'd convinced himself he didn't deserve happiness, who'd built such strong defenses against disappointment that he couldn't recognize opportunity when it stood directly in front of him. Later that night, alone in her bedroom, she found herself looking at the simple gold band on her left hand. Thomas's ring, the symbol of promises made and kept until death ended them. She'd worn it every day for 6 years, through marriage and widowhood, through grief and the slow process of learning to live alone. Now, for the first time, she slipped it off. The ring felt heavy in her palm, warm from her skin and worn smooth by years of wear. Setting it on the dresser beside the wooden horse Thomas had carved felt like a betrayal and a release, simultaneously an acknowledgement that some chapters ended so others could begin. She wasn't ready to put the ring away permanently, but maybe she was ready to stop wearing it like armor, to stop using Thomas's memory as a shield against the possibility of feeling something new. The next morning brought news that drove all thoughts of rings and feelings from her mind. Jake Rawlings rode in before dawn, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with urgency. "They're back," he said without preamble. "Railroad men, surveyors, and a couple of fellows who looked like hired guns, camped just beyond the property line, acting like they're waiting for something." Willa felt her stomach drop. How many? 8, maybe 10. Too many to be just surveyors. Colt appeared from the barn, moving with the fluid alertness of a man accustomed to trouble. "What kind of men?" "Hard men," Jake said, "the kind who get paid to intimidate people who won't be reasonable." "They're testing boundaries," Colt observed, "seeing how we'll react to pressure." "What do you recommend?" Willa asked. "That we show them we're not easily intimidated, but carefully, no point in starting a fight we might not finish." The rational part of her mind knew he was right. But another part, the part that had fought for 3 years to maintain her independence, wanted to ride out and confront these men immediately. Her land, her rules, her right to defend what she'd built. "They're counting on you being afraid," Colt said, as if reading her thoughts. "Don't give them the satisfaction." "I'm not afraid." "I know you're not. But being brave and being smart aren't the same thing." His quiet confidence steadied her, reminded her that she wasn't facing this alone. Whatever happened next, she had allysmen who respected her judgment and would stand with her when the real confrontation came. And it would come. She could feel it building like a storm on the horizon, the tension that preceded moments when everything changed. The railroad men had shown their hand by bringing hired guns, had revealed this was about more than simple business negotiation. But as she looked at Colt's determined face, at Jake's loyal support, at the ranch that represented everything she'd fought to preserve, Willa felt something she hadn't expected, not fear, but anticipation. Let them come with their threats and intimidation. She'd built something worth defending here, and she had no intention of giving it up without a fight. The document that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous clerk from Wheeler's bank, who wouldn't meet Willa's eyes as he handed over the official envelope. The paper inside was expensive, heavy stock, with embossed letterhead, but the words it contained were devastating in their simplicity. "Notice of contested property ownership," she read aloud, her voice growing tighter with each line. "The Colorado and Southern Railroad Company hereby claims legal title to the following described lands, based on prior Spanish land grant predating current territorial filing." Jake Rawlings stood beside her kitchen table, his weathered face dark with anger as she read. "Spanish land grant? That's horseshit. Pardon my language. Your husband filed proper claim to this land, went through all the territorial requirements. Says here they have documentation proving the original grant was never legally dissolved when the territory changed hands from Mexico." Willa's hands shook slightly as she set the papers down. "They're claiming Thomas's filing was invalid because the land was already owned." Colt moved to the window, scanning the horizon with the automatic wariness of a man who'd learned to expect trouble. Convenient timing. Wonder how long they've been sitting on this supposed documentation. "The hearing is set for next Monday, in Denver." Willa continued reading. "I'm required to appear with all original filing documents, proof of purchase, and any evidence supporting my claim to ownership." "It's a setup," Jake said flatly. "They're trying to steal your land legal-like, make it look official." "But how can they do this?" "Thomas researched the title carefully before we filed. He wouldn't have made that kind of mistake." Colt turned from the window, his expression grim. "They probably didn't have to forge anything. Spanish land grants were notorious for overlapping boundaries, vague descriptions. Easy enough to find some old document that could be interpreted to include your property." The implications settled over her like a cold fog. Even if she fought this in court, even if she proved the railroad's claim was fraudulent, the legal battle would cost more than she could afford. They were counting on Thetan, her being unable to sustain a prolonged fight against their resources. "There's more," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She held up a second document that had been folded inside the first. Notice of mortgage acceleration. Due to questions regarding property title, the bank is calling in my loan immediately. Full payment required within 30 days. Jake cursed under his breath. Wheeler's throwing in with them completely now. $48,000, she said, staring at the number that might as well have been 48 million. I don't have that kind of money liquid. I'd have to sell everything, cattle, equipment, everything Thomas and I built. Which is exactly what they want, Colt observed. Force you to sell, then buy the ranch for a fraction of its value when the bank forecloses. She stood abruptly, pacing to the stove where coffee sat cooling in the pot. The familiar motions of pouring a cup, adding sugar, stirring slowly, they helped calm the panic that threatened to overwhelm rational thought. There has to be something we can do, some way to fight this. There is, Colt said quietly. But you're not going to like it. Something in his tone made her look at him sharply. He was standing straighter than usual, his bearing subtly different, more military, more commanding. The change was so pronounced that Jake noticed it too, studying the other man with new interest. What do you mean? I mean that forged documents work both ways. If they can manufacture evidence to support their claim, we can find evidence to contradict it. That's illegal. So is what they're doing. The difference is, your cause is just. The simple certainty in his voice reminded her of their first conversation about Hellfire, the same quiet confidence that some things were worth the risk, that patience and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. You've done this before, she said. It wasn't a question. Different circumstances. Same principle. He moved to join her by the stove, his presence solid and reassuring. During the war, I spent a lot of time behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence, disrupting supply lines. Sometimes that meant creative interpretation of documents and identities. Jake leaned forward, suddenly alert. Just what kind of cavalry scout were you? The kind that didn't officially exist. Colt's smile was grim. Special operations, they called it. Missions that required flexibility with rules and regulations. Understanding dawned on Willa with the force of revelation. The careful way he moved, the automatic assessment of tactical situations, the quiet authority that emerged when circumstances demanded it. Colt Morgan hadn't been just any soldier. He'd been elite, special, the kind of man the army sent when conventional approaches weren't enough. You could really do this? Find a way to prove their documents are fake? I could try. But it would mean going to Denver, getting close to people who have reason to be suspicious of strangers. And if we're caught, we'd go to prison. You'd go to prison. I'd probably just disappear. His matter-of-fact tone chilled her. These railroad men have connections, resources. They don't fight fair when their investments are threatened. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of cattle moving in the pastures. Willa stared into her coffee cup, weighing impossible choices against unacceptable losses. What would you need? She asked finally. A few days in Denver to scout their operation, see how they're organizing their evidence, access to their legal documents, maybe their correspondence, and lot of luck. It's too dangerous, Jake protested. If they're willing to steal land through forged papers, they won't hesitate to hurt anyone who gets in their way. The alternative is losing everything, Willa pointed out. At least this way, we're fighting back. She looked at Colt, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since he'd arrived at her gate asking for work. Not just a drifter seeking temporary employment, but a man with skills and experience that went far beyond breaking horses and mending fences. A man who'd fought in shadows and won battles through intelligence rather than force. Why? She asked. Why would you risk this for me? His grey eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Because this ranch isn't just your home, Willa. It's become mine too, and a man protects his home. The words hung between them, carrying weight that went beyond simple employment, beyond the careful distance they'd been maintaining. This was a declaration, an acknowledgement of feelings neither had been willing to voice directly. When would you leave? She asked. Tomorrow morning. The hearing is Monday, which gives me 5 days to gather what we need. I'm coming with you. Absolutely not. It's my ranch, my fight, and my area of expertise. His voice carried an authority she hadn't heard before, the tone of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions quickly. This kind of work requires specific skills, Willa. Skills you don't have and don't want to learn. She wanted to argue, but the rational part of her mind recognized the truth in his words. Whatever he planned to do in Denver, it would require abilities honed by years of military service, experience with deception and infiltration that she couldn't pretend to possess. What do I do while you're gone? You stay here, run the ranch, act like nothing has changed. If anyone asks, I've gone to visit family in Colorado Springs. Normal behavior, nothing suspicious. And if you don't come back? The question came out sharper than she'd intended, revealing fears she'd been trying to suppress. The thought of losing him, of facing this battle alone, terrified her more than the prospect of losing the ranch. I'll come back, he said simply. I promise. That evening, she found him in the barn, checking his gear with the methodical precision of a soldier preparing for a mission. His few possessions were laid out on a blanket, spare clothes, basic supplies, and items she didn't recognize, but suspected were tools of whatever trade he'd practiced during the war. Colt, she said, stepping into the lamplight. He looked up from examining what appeared to be a set of lockpicks, his expression carefully neutral. Something wrong? I wanted to thank you for what you're willing to do, the risk you're taking. You don't need to thank me for protecting what's mine. The possessive certainty in his voice sent warmth through her chest. When had she stopped being just his employer and become something worth claiming? Is that what I am? Yours? He stood slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. Do you want to be? Instead of answering with words, she stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, close enough to smell the familiar scent of leather and horse and honest work that clung to his clothes. Ask me again when you come back from Denver, she said softly. Why then? Because I want to answer when we both know you're staying. He reached out to touch her face, his scarred fingers gentle against her cheek. I'm staying, Willa. Whatever happens in Denver, whatever we have to face after that, I'm not running anymore. The kiss that followed was different from the careful, hesitant affection they'd been building toward. This was a claiming, a promise, an acknowledgement that whatever happened next, they would face it together. When they finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against his, breathing in the certainty of his presence. Come home to me, she whispered. I will, he promised, and when I do, we'll finish what we started. The next morning, she watched him ride away toward Denver, sitting straight in his saddle with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of. In his saddlebag, alongside the tools of whatever dangerous work awaited him, was the forged property deed that threatened to destroy everything she'd built. But for the first time since receiving those devastating documents, Willa felt something that might have been hope. Colt Morgan was more than just a patient horse trainer or a reliable ranch hand. He was a man who fought battles in shadows and won them through intelligence and determination rather than simple force. If anyone could find a way to expose the railroad's deception, it was him. And when he returned, when, not if, because failure wasn't something she could afford to consider, they would face whatever came next as partners, as equals, as two people who'd found in each other something worth fighting for. 4 days passed without word from Colt. 4 days during which Willa maintained the fiction that everything was normal while her world balanced on the edge of collapse. She rose before dawn, tended to ranch business, supervised the hands, and smiled when people in town asked after her hired man's sudden trip to visit family. Inside, she counted hours and worried about shadows that might contain enemies, about a man who'd promised to return but might be lying dead in a Denver alley. On Thursday evening, Jake found her in the barn, grooming horses that didn't need grooming, her movements sharp with contained anxiety. "You're going to brush the hide right off that mare if you don't ease up," he observed. "I need to keep busy." "What you need is to get some sleep. You look like hell, pardon my saying so." She did feel like hell, hollow-eyed and jumpy, starting at every unexpected sound, every rider approaching the ranch. The railroad men's camp beyond her property line had grown larger each day, more men arriving with the purposeful air of soldiers preparing for battle. "They know something," she said, setting down the brush. "The way they're positioning themselves, the timing they know. Colt isn't just visiting family." "Maybe. Or maybe they're just getting ready for Monday's hearing, making sure you understand the stakes." Monday, 3 days away, and still no word from Denver. No telegram, no message, no sign that her last desperate gamble had any chance of succeeding. "Mrs. Dunne?" Tom Fletcher appeared in the barn doorway, his young face tense with excitement. "Rider coming up from town, moving fast." Her heart jumped, hope and fear warring in her chest as she hurried outside. The rider was indeed moving quickly, bent low over his horse's neck, but even at a distance she could see it wasn't Colt. Too slight in build. Wrong horse entirely. The messenger pulled up in a cloud of dust, a boy from the telegraph office, with the kind of urgency that usually preceded bad news. "Mrs. Dunne? Got a wire for you from Denver." She took the yellow paper with hands that trembled, despite her efforts to remain calm. Jake moved closer, ready to provide support if the news was as bad as she feared. "Documents acquired. Stop returning tomorrow. Stop. Trust me. Stop. CM." Relief flooded through her so suddenly that her knees nearly buckled. He was alive, he'd found something useful, and he was coming home. The message was cryptic, probably intentionally so, but the important information was clear. Colt Morgan kept his promises. "Good news?" Jake asked, reading her expression. "He's coming back tomorrow, and he found what we needed." That night, she climbed the stairs to her bedroom with a lighter heart than she'd carried in days. Tomorrow would bring answers, would reveal whether Colt's dangerous mission had uncovered evidence strong enough to fight the railroad's manufactured claims. On her dresser, Thomas's wedding ring caught the lamplight where she'd left it 4 days ago. The sight of it no longer brought the sharp stab of guilt she'd expected. Instead, she felt something like gratitude for the love it represented, for the years of happiness it symbolized, and for the permission it seemed to grant her to love again differently but no less deeply. From the drawer that held Thomas's letters, she withdrew a different kind of keepsake, a cavalry saber wrapped in oiled cloth, the blade gleaming despite its age. Her father had carried it during the war between the states, had passed it to Thomas when they married, with the hope that it would protect his new son-in-law should danger ever threaten their family. Thomas had never needed to draw the sword in anger, but somehow it seemed fitting that it might serve its intended purpose at last. If the railroad men brought violence to her door, they would discover that the widow of Larkspur Crossing was better prepared than they assumed. The next morning dawned clear and cold, autumn air carrying the promise of winter in the mountains. Willa stood on her porch with coffee growing cold in her hands, watching the road that wound through the valley toward Denver. Somewhere out there, Colt was riding home with evidence that might save everything she'd fought to preserve. By noon, her patience had frayed to breaking point. Jake found her pacing the kitchen like a caged animal, checking and rechecking the ancient rifle Thomas had kept above the fireplace. "He'll be here," Jake said with the calm certainty of a man who'd learned to judge character accurately. "That one doesn't make promises he can't keep. What if they caught him? What if he's... Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But worrying won't change anything." She knew he was right, but knowing and feeling were different things entirely. Every minute that passed without Colt's return was another minute for doubt to grow, for fear to whisper that she'd sent a good man to his death for the sake of property that might not be worth the cost. At 2 o'clock, Tom Fletcher came running from the south pasture, his face flushed with excitement and exertion. "Riders coming," he called. 3 of them, moving steady from the Denver road. Willa's heart leaped, then plummeted as the implications sank in. 3 riders, not one. If Colt was returning alone as planned, who were the others? She grabbed the rifle and stepped onto the porch, Jake materializing beside her with his own weapon. Through the afternoon haze, she could make out the approaching figurist men, riding hard, a third horse trailing behind with what appeared to be an empty saddle. "Something's wrong," she breathed. But as they drew closer, her eyes resolved details that made her gasp with relief. The lead rider was indeed Colt, sitting his horse with the easy confidence she'd come to know so well. The second rider wore the blue uniform of a federal marshal, and the third horse carried saddlebags that bulged with what appeared to be documents. Colt dismounted in her yard with the fluid grace of a man who'd ridden hard but successfully, his grey eyes finding hers immediately and holding them with an intensity that spoke of triumph. "Mrs. Dunn," he said formally, touching his hat brim, "I'd like you to meet Marshal Robert Hayes, Federal District Attorney for Colorado Territory." The marshal, a lean man with intelligent eyes and prematurely grey hair, stepped forward with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Mrs. Dunn, I understand you've been having some trouble with questionable land claims." "Yes, sir. The railroad company is about to discover that falsifying federal documents carries serious penalties," the marshal finished grimly. "Mr. Morgan has provided us with very interesting evidence regarding their business practices." Colt was already moving toward his horse, retrieving saddlebags that clinked metallically as he lifted them. "Show her what we found," he said to the marshal. Marshal Hayes opened his own saddlebags and withdrew a thick folder of documents. Original correspondence between the Colorado and Southern Railroad and a forger in St. Louis, detailing the creation of fraudulent Spanish land grants, payment receipts for services rendered, and most damning of all, a letter from the railroad's legal counsel outlining their strategy to use manufactured documentation to force property sales at below-market prices. Willa stared at the papers in disbelief. "You found all of this in Denver?" "Mr. Morgan found it," the marshal corrected. "Quite skillfully, I might add. The railroad company made the mistake of keeping detailed records of their illegal activities." Colt's expression remained carefully neutral, but she caught a glint of satisfaction in his grey eyes. "They were arrogant," he said simply, "kept everything in a safe in their hotel suite, thought they were too clever to be caught." "How did you?" she began, then stopped herself. Some questions were better left unasked, especially with a federal marshal present. "The important thing," Marshal Hayes continued, "is that we have enough evidence to not only dismiss their claim against your property, but to bring criminal charges against everyone involved in the scheme." Jake let out a whoop of celebration, but Willa found herself studying Colt's face, noting the tension around his eyes, the way his hands rested near his weapons with unconscious readiness. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked quietly. "The railroad men know their documents were stolen," Colt admitted. "They've hired professional gunmen, Willa, not just intimidator skillers. They're camped about 2 miles south of here, waiting for orders." Marshal Hayes nodded grimly. "We rode past their position on the way in. 12 men, well-armed, organized like a military unit. They're not planning to simply pack up and leave when their legal case falls apart." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Even with evidence of the railroad's fraud, even with federal law on her side, she was still in danger. Men who would forge documents to steal land wouldn't hesitate to use violence when their scheme was exposed. "What do we do?" she asked. "We prepare for a fight," Colt said with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who'd faced such situations before. "They'll probably wait until after dark, try to catch us unprepared. But if we're ready for them, I can't ask you to risk your life for my land." "You're not asking. I'm volunteering." His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "This is my home now, Willa. These are my people to protect." Marshal Hayes cleared his throat diplomatically. "I should mention that I've sent word to the territorial authorities. Help should arrive within 24 hours. The question is whether you can hold out until then." "We can hold out," Jake said with the confidence of a man who'd fought in range wars before. "This ranch has good defensive positions, and we know the ground better than they do." "How many men do we have?" Colt asked, his mind already shifting to tactical considerations. 8, counting myself and the marshal here," Jake replied. "All good shots, all willing to fight for what's right. Against 12 professional gunmen, Marshal Hayes pointed out, the odds aren't favorable. The odds don't matter, Willa said firmly. This is our land, our home, we fight for it. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the ranch transformed into a fortress. Under Colt's direction, the hands positioned themselves at strategic points, the barn loft with its commanding view, the bunkhouse with its thick walls, the main house with its solid construction and multiple firing positions. They'll try to burn us out first, Colt explained as they checked weapons and ammunition. Set fire to the outbuildings, force us into the open where they can pick us off. Our job is to prevent that, keep them at distance until help arrives. Willa found herself moving through preparations with a strange sense of calm. This was the moment she'd been building toward since Thomas died, the final test of whether she truly belonged on this land, whether she had the strength to hold what was hers against those who would take it. As the sun began to set, painting the hills in shades of gold and crimson, she stood on her porch one last time before the battle. The ranch spread before her in all its hard-won beauty cattle, grazing peacefully in pastures she'd fought to maintain. Buildings she'd kept in good repair through 3 years of struggle. Land that represented everything she and Thomas had dreamed of building together. Colt joined her, the cavalry saber strapped to his side, catching the last light of day. He'd found it in the house and claimed it without asking, understanding instinctively that some battles required more than just guns and strategy. "Whatever happens tonight," he said quietly, "I want you to know that these past weeks have been the happiest of my life." "Don't talk like that," she replied fiercely. "We're going to win this fight, and afterward we're going to build something beautiful here together." "Yes," he agreed, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "We are." In the distance, points of light began to flicker as the gunmen lit their campfires, preparing for the violence that would come with darkness. But here on the porch where she'd spent so many peaceful evenings, surrounded by men willing to fight for her right to remain, Willa felt something she hadn't expected. Not fear, but anticipation. Not dread, but fierce joy at the prospect of finally meeting her enemies head-on, of proving once and for all that some things couldn't be taken, only earned, and that those who tried to steal what didn't belong to them would learn the cost of underestimating a woman who'd already lost everything once and refused to lose it again. The battle for the Double D Ranch was about to begin, and she was ready. The attack came at dawn, not in the darkness Colt had predicted. Willa was in the kitchen, preparing coffee for the men who'd kept watch all night, when the first rifle shots echoed across the valley, followed immediately by the sound of splintering wood as bullets struck the barn. "They're coming from 3 directions," Jake's voice carried from the loft where he'd positioned himself as lookout, "trying to pin us down while they burn the outbuildings." Through the kitchen window, she could see smoke beginning to rise from the direction of the equipment shed. The gunmen had moved closer than anyone expected, using the pre-dawn darkness to get within striking distance before launching their assault. Colt appeared in the doorway, his cavalry saber strapped across his back, a rifle in his hands. "They're professionals," he said grimly. "Coordinated attack, multiple firing positions. This isn't just intimidation, they mean to finish this permanently." "How many?" "All of them, looks like. They're not holding anyone in reserve." The sound of breaking glass came from the front of the house as a bullet shattered the parlor window. Willa grabbed her rifle from beside the stove, checking the load with movements made automatic by years of ranch life. "Where do you need me?" "Upstairs, north window. You'll have a good field of fire toward the barn. Can cover Jake if they try to rush his position." As she climbed the stairs, the house shook with the impact of multiple rifle shots. These weren't warning shots or attempts at intimidation. The gunman was shooting to kill, trying to eliminate resistance as quickly as possible. From her bedroom window, she could see the tactical situation clearly. The attackers had indeed approached from multiple directions, establishing firing positions that covered all the ranch's defensive points. Smoke was rising from both the equipment shed and what looked like the chicken coop systematic destruction designed to eliminate cover and force the defenders into the open. A movement near the water trough caught her eye, and she raised her rifle, drawing a careful bead on a man, trying to work his way closer to the main house. The shot echoed across the yard, and the gunman stumbled, clutching his shoulder before scrambling back to cover. "Good shooting," Jake called from the barn loft. "That'll make them think twice about rushing us." But even as she reloaded, Willa could see the attackers adapting their strategy. Instead of trying to overrun the ranch's defenses quickly, they were settling in for a siege, using their superior numbers to maintain constant pressure from multiple angles. A section of the barn's roof suddenly burst into flame where someone had managed to throw a torch or fire arrow. The dry wood caught quickly, sending smoke billowing across the yard and reducing visibility. "They're trying to burn us out," Tom Fletcher's voice carried from the bunkhouse, high with tension but steady. "Let them try," Jake responded. "We've got water barrels positioned, and that fire will take hours to spread enough to matter." Through the smoke, Willa caught glimpses of the battle unfolding across her ranch. Colt had positioned himself near the front porch, using the thick support posts as cover, while he returned fire with the methodical precision of a trained soldier. His shots were carefully aimed, each one intended to either wound an attacker or force them back from advancing positions. Marshal Hayes had taken position at the side of the house, his federal authority meaning nothing in this moment there. He was simply another defender fighting for his life alongside people he'd sworn to protect. The coordinated nature of the attack became clearer as minutes passed. The gunmen weren't simply shooting randomly, they were working to specific positions, trying to eliminate the ranch's defensive advantages one by one. Fire arrows continued to arc through the smoky air, targeting any structure that might provide cover for the defenders. A thunderous crash from downstairs made her jump something heavy, hitting the front door with enough force to splinter wood. They were trying to break in, to turn the house itself into a battleground where numbers would count more than defensive positioning. "Willa!" Colt's voice carried from below, tight with urgency. "They're trying to breach the front door. I need you to cover the back entrance." She moved quickly to the rear bedroom, positioning herself where she could watch the kitchen door and the path that led from the creek. Sure enough, 3 men were working their way through the tall grass, trying to approach the house from what they thought was an undefended direction. Her first shot scattered them, sending all 3 diving for cover behind the woodpile. But they regrouped quickly, and she realized with growing concern that these weren't ordinary hired guns. They moved with military precision, communicating through hand signals, advancing by bounds while maintaining covering fire. "Professional soldiers," she muttered, understanding now why Colt had been so concerned about their chances. These men had training and experience that matched his own, turning the battle into a contest between equals rather than a simple fight between defenders and common criminals. The burning beam that crashed through the barn roof sent sparks cascading across the yard, and she could see that the fire was spreading faster than Jake had predicted. The dry autumn weather worked against them. What should have been slow-burning green wood caught and flamed like tinder. "Jake," she called toward the barn, "you need to get out of there." "Not yet," came his reply. "I can see their positions from up here. Give me 5 more minutes." But 5 minutes might be too long. Even as she watched, another section of the barn roof began to smoke, and she could see flames licking at the hay stored in the loft. Jake was risking his life to maintain their best observation point, but if the structure collapsed, they'd lose both the position and one of their most experienced fighters. A bullet splintered the window frame inches from her head, reminding her that standing exposed while worrying about Jake was a luxury she couldn't afford. She dropped back from the window, working her way to a different angle where she could maintain fire on the approaching gunman without presenting such an obvious target. The battle had been raging for perhaps 20 minutes, but already she could feel the tide turning against them. The attackers had more men, more ammunition, and the advantage of coordinated strategy. Worse, they seemed willing to accept casualties in order to achieve their objective. This wasn't just about stealing land anymore, but about eliminating witnesses who could testify to their crimes. Through the smoke and chaos, she caught sight of Colt near the front porch, the cavalry saber now in his hands, as he engaged two gunmen who'd managed to get close enough for hand-to-hand combat. Even at a distance, she could see the deadly grace with which he moved, the economy of motion that spoke to years of training in close-quarters fighting. But there were too many of them, and they kept coming, pressing their attack with the relentless pressure of professionals who understood that victory required accepting losses to achieve objectives. The ranch that had been her sanctuary was becoming a battlefield, and despite the courage of the men fighting beside her, Willa could see that courage alone might not be enough to save the home she'd fought so hard to preserve. The moment that changed everything came when Jake's voice cut through the gunfire with desperate urgency. "Hellfire's loose!" The fire spooked him, broke right through the corral fence. Through the smoke, Willa could see the black stallion rearing and plunging in the yard, his eyes rolling white with terror as bullets whined around him. In his panic, he was charging directly toward the group of gunmen, positioned near the water trough and directly into the line of fire. Without thinking, Colt broke from his defensive position, running toward the terrified horse with the cavalry saber still in his hand. It was madness, exposing himself to multiple shooters for the sake of an animal, but Willa understood instantly why he'd done it. Hellfire represented more than just a horse. He was the symbol of everything wild and free that they were fighting to protect. "Cover him!" she shouted, raising her rifle to engage the gunman, threatening both Colt and the stallion. What happened next seemed to unfold in dreamlike slow motion. Colt reached Hellfire just as the horse reared again, his hands gentle despite the chaos surrounding them. Instead of trying to capture or control the stallion, he simply stood beside him, one hand on the black neck, his voice a low murmur of reassurance that somehow carried through the gunfire. And incredibly, impossibly, Hellfire calmed. Not completely, his muscles still quivered with tension, his ears swiveled constantly tracking threats, but he stopped his panic charges and stood trembling beside the man who'd spent weeks earning his trust. The gunman, seeing this strange tableau in the middle of their battlefield, hesitated for just a moment. It was exactly the opening Colt had been waiting for. With fluid grace, he swung onto Hellfire's bare back, the stallion accepting his weight without protest. Then, with a wild cry that seemed to come from some primal place, Colt drew the cavalry saber and charged directly at the attacker's main position. The sight was magnificent, and terribleman and horse moving as one, the blade catching morning light as it swept in deadly arcs, the stallion's hooves striking down anyone who stood in their path. It was cavalry warfare from an earlier age, desperate and beautiful and utterly ruthless. "Jesus Christ," Marshal Hayes breathed from his position by the house. "I've never seen anything like that." The charge broke the attackers' coordinated assault, scattering them as they tried to avoid the stallion's hooves and Colt's blade. But more importantly, it revealed something Willa had suspected but hadn't dared hope. These professional gunmen, for all their training and experience, hadn't expected to face someone whose skills matched their own. Colt wheeled Hellfire in a tight turn, the horse responding to subtle pressure from his rider's legs as if they'd been partners for years instead of weeks. Together, they struck again at a group of gunmen trying to regroup near the burning barn, the saber sweeping with lethal precision while Hellfire's iron-shod hooves became weapons in their own right. "Now," Jake's voice carried from the barn loft, where he'd maintained his position despite the spreading flames. "While they're scattered, push them back." The remaining defenders emerged from their positions, with rifles blazing, pressing their sudden advantage. Tom Fletcher and two other ranch hands advanced from the bunkhouse, their shots carefully aimed at gunmen who were still reeling from Colt's unexpected cavalry charge. Marshal Hayes moved to flank the attackers from the side, his federal authority now backed by devastating accuracy with a rifle. But it was the sight of Colt and Hellfire that dominated the battlefield, an image of wild freedom that embodied everything the railroad men were trying to destroy. The tide of battle turned in those crucial minutes. Faced with a level of resistance they hadn't expected, caught off guard by tactics that seemed to come from another century, the surviving gunmen began to fall back toward their horses. But their leader, a cold-eyed man with the bearing of a military officer, wasn't ready to retreat. Drawing his pistol, he took careful aim at Colt, who was engaged with two other attackers and couldn't see the threat developing. Willa's rifle spoke without conscious thought on her part, the bullet taking the gunman in the chest and spinning him around before he could fire. The shot was perfect, instinctive, born of a lifetime spent hunting and 3 years of protecting what was hers. "That's for thinking a woman wouldn't fight back," she said quietly, working the rifle's action to chamber another round. The death of their leader broke the remaining attackers' will to continue. Within minutes, the surviving gunmen were in full retreat, abandoning their wounded and fleeing toward the horses they'd left hidden in the distant trees. Colt guided Hellfire to a stop in the center of the yard, both horse and rider breathing hard but uninjured. The stallion stood calmly now, his trust in his rider absolute despite the chaos they'd just survived together. "Well," Marshal Hayes said, emerging from his position with his rifle still ready, "that's not exactly how they teach cavalry tactics at West Point." "Sometimes you have to improvise," Colt replied, dismounting with the fluid grace of a natural horseman. His hand remained on Hellfire's neck, maintaining the connection that had allowed them to function as a perfect team. Jake climbed down from the barn loft as the flames finally reached his position, his weathered face split by a grin of fierce satisfaction. "Haven't seen fighting like that since the war," he said. "Thought cavalry charges went out with the Romans. Everything old becomes new again when you're desperate enough," Colt observed, checking the stallion for injuries. "Besides, Hellfire needed to know he could trust me in the worst circumstances. Now he knows." As the smoke began to clear, Willa surveyed the damage to her ranch. The equipment shed was a total loss. The barn would need extensive repairs, and bullet holes marked almost every building. But the core structures remained intact, and more importantly, everyone who'd stood with her had survived. In the distance, a column of dust announced the arrival of federal reinforcements, the help Marshal Hayes had promised, arriving just hours too late to affect the outcome, but in perfect time to arrest any surviving attackers and ensure the railroad's criminal conspiracy would face full legal consequences. "It's over," she said, hardly believing the words even as she spoke them. "Yes," Colt agreed, his hand finding hers with the natural ease of a man claiming what belonged to him. "It's over." The battle for the Double D Ranch had ended not with superior numbers or overwhelming firepower, but with the kind of desperate courage that came from defending something irreplaceable. And in the center of it all, the partnership between a patient man and a wild horse had proven that some bonds, once forged through trust and time, could withstand anything the world might throw against them. Standing in her bullet-scarred yard, surrounded by the wreckage of battle but still holding the land she'd fought to preserve, Willa understood that she'd won more than just a victory over the railroad's greed. She'd proven to herself and everyone else that some things truly were worth fighting for, and that sometimes the greatest strength came not from standing alone, but from choosing the right people to stand beside. 3 months later, on a crisp December morning that painted the mountains silver with fresh snow, Willa Mae Dunne became Willa Mae Morgan in a ceremony that brought together every soul in Larkspur Crossing and half the surrounding counties besides. The wedding took place in the meadow behind the rebuilt barn, with Hellfire standing calm and proud nearby, wearing ribbons in his black mane and serving as living proof that wild things could choose partnership without losing their essential spirit. The stallion had become something of a legend in the weeks following the battle, drawing visitors from as far away as Denver who wanted to see the horse that had charged armed gunmen and lived to tell the tale. "You sure about this?" Jake Rawlings asked Colt as they waited for Willa to appear. The foreman wore his best suit, brushed clean for the occasion, his weathered face split by a grin that hadn't faded since the engagement was announced. "Surest I've ever been about anything," Colt replied, adjusting the new wedding ring that felt strange but right on his finger. He wore his dress uniform from the cavalry, the blue wool carefully preserved despite years of drifting, the brass buttons polished to mirror brightness for this most important of occasions. The legal aftermath of the railroad scheme had unfolded exactly as Marshal Hayes predicted. Faced with overwhelming evidence of fraud and conspiracy, the Colorado and Southern Railroad had quietly abandoned their claims to the valley, paid substantial damages to the territorial government, and seen 3 of their executives sentenced to federal prison. Marcus Wheeler, caught between his loyalty to old friends and pressure from criminal conspirators, had resigned his position at the bank and left Colorado entirely, though not before ensuring that Willa's mortgage was restructured on terms so favorable they amounted to an apology. But those victories, significant as they were, paled beside the simpler triumph of 2 hearts, finally admitting what they'd known from the beginning, that some partnerships were meant to last forever. When Willa appeared at the end of the makeshift aisle, wearing her mother's wedding dress altered to fit her own strong frame, Colt felt his breath catch in his throat. She moved with the confident grace of a woman who'd fought for everything she had and won, her eyes bright with joy and certainty as she approached the altar where their future waited. The ceremony itself was simple, conducted by the circuit preacher with words that emphasized partnership and mutual respect rather than submission and obedience. When they exchanged vows, it was with the understanding that they were promising to stand together as equals, to face whatever challenges might come as a united front. Do you, Colt Morgan, take this woman to be your wife, to stand beside her in good times and bad, to honor her strength and support her dreams? I do, he said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who'd found his home at last. Do you, Willa Dunne, take this man to be your husband, to stand beside him in good times and bad, to honor his strength and support his dreams? I do, she replied, her voice strong and clear, carrying across the meadow to where their friends and neighbors stood witness to promises that felt as solid as the mountains surrounding them. The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle but firm, a claiming that spoke to passion carefully banked but never denied. When they broke apart, the cheers of the assembled crowd seemed to echo off the hills themselves, as if the land itself approved of this union. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with fiddle music and dancing, with speeches that ranged from heartfelt to hilarious, with enough food and drink to satisfy even the heartiest appetites. But for Willa and Colt, the most meaningful moments came in the quiet spaces between festivities, when they could simply stand together and marvel at how perfectly their separate lives had combined into something larger and stronger than either could have achieved alone. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed chosen specifically for their wedding day, they found themselves alone for the first time as husband and wife. The guests had begun to drift away, sated with celebration, and satisfied that they'd witnessed something rare and special, a love story that had overcome every obstacle to reach its proper conclusion. So, Willa said, settling into Colt's arms with the natural ease of a woman who'd found her perfect fit, what do we do now? Now. He smiled, his hands gentle on her waist as they swayed to music that existed only in their hearts. Now we build something beautiful together. We raise horses and cattle. We plant gardens. We make this ranch into everything Thomas dreamed it could be, and more. Children, she asked, the word carrying hope and fear in equal measure. If we're blessed with them, if not, we'll be content with what we have each other, this land, the life we're creating together. She looked out over the ranch that had nearly cost them everything, noting how the rebuilt barn stood stronger than before, how the scars of battle had already begun to fade into memory. The wooden horse Thomas had carved still sat on her dresser upstairs, but now it represented possibility rather than loss, hope rather than grief. I love you, Colt Morgan, she said, the words coming easily now that fear no longer constrained them. I love you too, Willa Morgan, he replied, and the sound of her new name on his lips felt like a promise kept, a future claimed, a wild heart finally choosing to trust. In the pasture beyond the house, Hellfire lifted his magnificent head and whinnied not with the desperate loneliness that had marked his early years, but with the contentment of a creature that had found its proper place in the world. Like his human companions, the Stallion had learned that wildness and partnership weren't contradictory, that the strongest bonds were those chosen freely rather than imposed by force. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Willa and Colt Morgan began their life together with the understanding that they'd already survived the worst that fate could throw at them. Whatever challenges might command, they would come. As they did to all who dared to build something lasting, they would face them as they'd faced everything else. Together, with patience and determination, and the absolute certainty that some things were worth any fight required to preserve them. The ranch that had begun as Thomas and Willa's dream had become something new and different, but no less precious a place, where wild hearts could choose love without losing their essential spirit, where patience conquered force, and where two people who'd learned to trust slowly had discovered that the best partnerships were built on foundations of mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of love deep enough to weather any storm. In the end, that was what the challenge had really been about, not taming a horse or winning a dare, but learning that the most worthwhile victories came not from breaking wild things, but from earning their trust, respecting their nature, and building something beautiful together that honored both strength and gentleness, independence and partnership, the wild freedom of individual spirit, and the deeper satisfaction of choosing to share that freedom with someone worthy of the gift.